Well, Jonathan, here we are. We are doing we've been invited by Barista Hustle to do a Q&A session on the history of coffee. How are you feeling today?
I'm feeling very nervous, would be the truth. I'm feeling very nervous, because, one of the great things about making programs and writing books is also knowing how to leave out things that you don't quite know, which means that we kind of opened ourselves up to doing more work here, James. The other is you are in Colombia remotely telling me how to use my tech, and I am less than confident that this is all working. But hey, this is fun. Let's go for it.
We're doing it.
And thanks to Barista Hustle, for inviting us.
Absolutely. Some fantastic questions. Yeah, this is our second attempt actually recording this, because yesterday it was a bit of a disaster. So
wipeout would be the word, I think. Yeah.
Or wipeout. Yes. But greeting. I'm from Medellin. I'm been touring the coffee triangle here in Colombia.
I am not envious at all.
Yeah. How's the snowstorms? How are they treating you?
We don't have snowstorms. We just have rain, a bit more rain. Occasional storm with rain, the usual.
Right, the usual. And for people who, maybe for Barista Hustle subscribers who are not familiar with A History of Coffee, I'll give a quick introduction to what it is. So A History of Coffee is a project. You wrote an excellent book called Coffee, A Global History. During the pandemic, I was in my garden, couldn't go anywhere, reading it. And I thought this would make a fantastic podcast series. So I reached out to you, and we created the first series of the History of Coffee, which has gone on to be heard over 100,000 times. Okay, so it's basically the History of Coffee in audio, done narratively, in this kind of format, me talking to you, but heavily edited.
Yeah.
And we recently released a second series, with the support of DeClieu, the espresso machine manufacturer, where we did some deep dives into some other topics in the history of coffee, like coffee shops, like the story of Haiti, the Italian espresso culture, and America and its infatuation with coffee.
Very good. I'm glad you remembered those. And we spent a lot of time on it, my God. But what was really nice, James? I got a few bits of feedback that said, the second series was even better than the first, which is great. I mean, that made me feel very good, because we did do a lot of work to get those in and rethink how to do it.
We really did. Yeah. And you're a professional historian, right?
I am.
You're actually at the University of Hertfordshire.
Or even Hertfordshire, as we say, but yeah.
Hertfordshire. And I'm a coffee professional, but I'm primarily an audio producer, documentary audio producer with my Filter Stories podcast.
Yeah.
Right. So the Barista Hustle peeps gave us some excellent questions. So I'm going to moderate and throw basically the questions at you for a bit more context. And I'm really excited to hear, I think there's some really excellent questions that came out that really got us thinking and exploring a little bit of new territory too, which was kind of fun.
Yeah.
So shall we kick off into this deep dive on the history of coffee? Barista Hustle edition.
Let's go for it and see how we get on.
So you guys did a lot of myth busting in season 1, but what about the Sun King, Louis XIV of France, right? We're talking now the kind of early 1700s. Was he really given a coffee plant by the mayor of Amsterdam? And is there any proof, apart from his own journal, that DeClieu actually used it to seed the plantations in Martinique and beyond? So maybe I'll just give a bit of context here. So we're talking early 1700s. And at the time, France has a number of places where it's growing coffee, right? The island of Bourbon, is that right?
The plants coffee in Bourbon about 1715, yeah.
Right. Which is a tiny little island.
It's a tiny little island. We now call it Réunion, yeah? Yeah, Réunion, off the coast of Africa, East Africa, yeah.
Right. And then Martinique is another island off the coast of Africa.
No.
Right?
Martinique is not off the coast of Africa. Martinique is in the Caribbean.
Okay.
Long way.
So, okay, interesting. And this is important because the Caribbean becomes a very big center of coffee production, right? Especially colonial coffee production. And a lot of the really horrible enslavement and atrocious conditions of the enslaved, are documented there. But it also helped France and other colonial powers become very rich. So, right, that's the context.
Yeah, that is the context. I mean, France becomes the key coffee producing colonial power in the 18th century, and that is based on its holdings in the Caribbean, Martinique, and particularly Saint-Domingue, which we now know as Haiti, as we talk about in the podcast.
Right.
Okay.
So it really matters then, kind of what this matter kind of matters. How did coffee get to the Caribbean, to the French-controlled part of the Caribbean, right? And so in this question, we have this character called DeClieu. Who's DeClieu?
Right, so DeClieu is this sort of son of a French noble, or a French noble himself, therefore, I guess. He's a bit of an adventurer. He goes to Martinique, establishes himself in Martinique, and ultimately obtains quite high rank, I believe, in Martinique within the French administration. He publishes a memoir towards the end of his sort of period of service, in which he produces this tale that says he went off to Martinique with this coffee seedling, and he shared his water with it on the voyage over, and he planted it, and lo and behold, Martinique became covered in coffee trees as a result of this.
Right, and okay, so it's a nice little story, protecting the coffee plant from the salty water.
It's a heroic story of a man who wants to be seen as a hero of coffee. Yeah.
So where did this little coffee seedling come from in his memoirs?
So in his memoirs, it comes from the Botanical Garden in Paris. And the first part of our question, therefore, is how did it get there? Was it given by the mayor to the king? And while I'm not sure that there was a particular transaction that said that did that, in the sense of literally being to the king, I think it's fairly likely, indeed, I don't think it's actually definitive, but I think it's extremely likely that did occur, because botanic gardens were exchanging specimens with each other, and the Amsterdam Botanic Garden was the first of those botanic gardens to have a coffee plant.
Right.
So it is likely that. So the story is the plant, in some way, moved from Amsterdam. A plant was taken from Amsterdam, or a seedling was taken from Amsterdam and taken to the French Botanic Garden, and there flourished. And from this, DeClieu cutting to take to Martinique. Okay. I think the first part is buyable. I'm going to say buyable. I'll buy part one. Okay. Did Martinique?
Which is what again?
Which is that the seed went from Amsterdam to the coffee went from Amsterdam to the French Botanical Garden.
Okay.
Okay. Part two. Did DeClieu take coffee to Martinique? Well, we have DeClieu's memoir that tells us that he did. We don't have anything that tells us that he didn't. So, how much do you want to believe DeClieu? Part three of the story was the rapid expansion of Martinique as a coffee area, all done with DeClieu's seedling. Dubious, I would say. Not least because there's already coffee in the Caribbean. There's coffee in Suriname. So, because the Dutch have already planted in Suriname. So it's equally, I mean, it would seem a much easier way to get your coffee would be to go and get some from Suriname, one way or another. Now, admittedly, colonial powers, we should also say, are not that keen to exchange resources. So, that might have been more difficult. But that is another possibility. It is less clear to me that DeClieu's seedling, assuming it existed, was actually the mother plant for all the coffee on Martinique. That's where I would go with it. So I'm saying this is not necessarily a myth, but something that certainly looks a bit mythologized in places, not least in DeClieu's own memoir.
Right, because it's a better story for DeClieu to say, hey, I got this plant all the way from France, from the Royal Botanical Garden, which was gifted by Louis the Sun King, and I planted it in Martinique, and that's what helped France become so much more wealthy as a result. That's a better story than saying, I mean, maybe that did happen, and a tree did make that journey and was planted in Martinique by DeClieu. But also, we did a little barter with the Dutch who were over there in Suriname, and we got a couple of those beans as well. It's a less nice story.
Yeah, exactly. But some of the dating kind of makes you think that that's a more possible story.
Right. I see. Okay, cool. There we are. Thank you for the question. Let's move on to number 2, shall we?
Yeah, I'm feeling already terrified. Let's go.
Okay, here we go. I'm interested in the pioneers and the Oregon Trail. I understand these folks had coffee, but I am curious how they got hold of it and what kind of prices they would have had to pay. And how would they have brewed it, and how might it have tasted? So, Jonathan, let me just help contextualize me in this place and time here. So we're talking the 1800s, America, the Oregon Trail. What's happening in America at this point?
Right. So this is the kind of inward expansion of Americans as they move from the east towards the west, settling the lands in between, trading all the way out to Oregon or wherever. Basically, this is the sort of, the story of the Great American Migration. This is the riding on the wagons, etc.
Because on the East Coast, Europeans had settled and they were expanding agriculture all the way west to the West
so
Coast.
this is the finding your big opportunities. So, I mean, I guess the Oregon Trail is particularly sort of thought of as about sort of the mid of the century, so the 1840s through to the 80s, maybe. How did they get the hold of the
contextualize that?
Yeah.
So I'm imagining, long trails of basically European settlers getting with their horses and their wagons, setting off on this long, long journey on these dusty roads or these muddy roads across America to basically find new land to grow stuff on and settle. So, and the story is that coffee, they were drinking coffee as they were kind of along this trail. Yeah. So, how would they have got hold of coffee?
Literally, where they get the coffee, there are sort of, if you like, catalog company wholesalers who will provide you with provisions for the trail. They will sell you the coffee in presumably a sack or something close to that, not necessarily the size of our coffee sacks, but a fairly big sort of portion. And they will roast and consume it as they go, because usually the coffee at this stage is green. When I say roast, it's probably sort of roasting on an open pan fire, and it is usually prepared in the kind of, the cowboy style mode of sort of crushing it into a kettle, putting the water in, boiling the lot over the fire and pouring.
Right.
What would it have tasted like? Warm? I mean, that might be caffeinated. I think it would have been, I would surmise that by this time most of the coffee would be coming probably that sort of Brazil origin coffee, fairly low quality. So it's really Rios probably at that point.
Okay.
And that tells its own story. As you know, Rio is not the most appealing of coffee to us, but you've been doing a day on the camp. Now there is a development over this period, because towards the end of the period, certainly, we are beginning to have branded coffee products. We're actually having coffee products, pre-roasted coffee products, created as coffee powder, the most famous of which is Arbuckles, of course. And this creates this sort of somewhat different scenario where you've got your pre-packed coffee, you put the powder in, you probably boil it still much the same way, but this also was supposedly glazed to prevent it going off. So it's kind of egg glazed coffee. Like
the roasted beans themselves were glazed with egg yolk?
Exactly. Yeah. There's also a sort of quite often a candy stick in these packages. So where the cook for these parties, because often you would go in kind of a convoy, would want someone to grind or prepare the coffee, he'd go, who wants the candy? And whoever wanted the candy would come and grind or prepare the coffee, take part in getting the coffee ready so as to sort of create the coffee. There are other interesting things. So the packaging on that Arbuckle's coffee used to have this image of a kind of an eagle-like angel on it. And this was sort of quite often bartered with Native Americans who were sort of told that this was symbolic of some kind of spiritual element. And they would presumably get some sense of that from just the caffeine that they might have got out of the package, as it were.
Interesting. So just to recap. So amazing. So to recap. So in the first half of this kind of Oregon Trail stories, as Europeans are migrating west to settle America, I can imagine, a sack of green coffee, in and amongst the sacks of flour and the sacks of everything else they would have taken with them.
Exactly.
And then every morning and afternoon, you take a handful of coffee, put it on the pan, roast it up, grind it up, maybe mortar and pestle, perhaps, maybe coffee grinder, who knows. And then, steep it in some hot water in a pan, strain it out, drink it straight, whatever. There you are. There's your coffee. It's a very romantic notion. And then later, as the trail gets more established, we also have, coffee brands themselves becoming much more, developed. So you have packages of coffee, which have, imagery of, angels and whatnot, which presumably, which you said people were bartering with the Native Americans who were along the trail, which is kind of crazy to think there's that interaction going on, and heaven knows what they wanted in exchange from the Native Americans. Maybe meat, fresh meat.
I would think that would be quite likely. Various kinds of foodstuffs, obviously. Cool. In a sense, it is, the evolution of this is also the evolution of coffee per se, because it's the evolution of coffee as an industrial product, coffee as a pre-roasted product, and so forth. But, that's it kind of fits with that thing.
Right. Love it. All right. Next question. Okay. So we are now talking England in the 1600s, at the beginning of the boom in coffee shops. Federico has a question for us. Apparently the term penny university was coined to describe the coffee houses in and around London and Oxford in the 17th century. Was it a term used back then, or was it made up later? And could you really get a coffee for a penny back then? What's that worth today? Okay, so bit of context, Jonathan. This is from our first episode on the rise of the coffee house, the transformative effect of the coffee house in history. And we covered, right, how in England in the 1600s, as coffee houses flourished, so did the exchange of information and trade, commerce, a lot of deals, politics, all discussed in the coffee house. And the idea is you could kind of rock up, give a penny, which was, by the sounds of it, not too much money back then. And you would be in and amongst all these people who knew so much, and you could learn so much. Hence the term penny university, right?
Yep. Okay.
And I guess the question is this an embellishment from later? Was it used at the time? And is it actually true? Was it only a penny? What's it worth today?
So this has been the fun question, has it not, James? And we will unleash you upon it in a while.
Okay.
Right. This one we can be a little more definitive. Did the coffee cost a penny? Yes. Were the terms penny university, was it actually used at the time? Yes, it would seem so. We have some sort of rhymes, and I'm going to sort of search for one in a minute that sort of actually features this. But we also had a book that was published that pretty much was a book of, what could you buy for a penny?
So the question is, what is that worth in today's money? Which is a very hard question to answer, right? So Jonathan, as you know, I actually studied economic history at university. For research for this little Barista Hustle thing, I did a little bit of research. So let me take you through my findings, right? And so I found some documents looking at kind of average wages in and around this time period. And people, like a bricklayer, for example, were earning about 8 pennies a day. So typical profession, 8 pennies a day. Right. So the idea is, what is a penny to be a part of this penny university, right? That's an eighth of your salary if you're a bricklayer. So what is an eighth of your salary today worth? And if we run the maths, right? So we actually did some maths down here. So we looked at the UK. In the UK right now, average salary is about, let's call it £35,000 average salary.
Yeah.
Now, per day worked, if you run the maths,
Yeah.
let's just assume, so 35,000 divided by 48 actual working weeks, assuming kind of 4 weeks off for holiday, divided by 5 working days per week, and divided by 8, which is, an eighth of your daily salary. And we've got to the answer that, today it would cost you about £18. So to go to a penny university back in the day, it would cost you the equivalent today of about 18 quid, which is not cheap.
No.
I mean, it's expensive, but I guess it's a lot more expensive than, what an Americano will cost you today, which is what, I don't know, £2.75. So it's almost 7 times more expensive than that.
I think the way of thinking about this, James,
it's pretty cheap for education,
to come into this is that, in one sense, yes, it shows you how potentially cheap. The idea was it's a penny university in the sense that, and this really sort of started being used, I think the rhyme originally comes from Oxford, and the idea was, well, you'd pick up so much knowledge for the penny. But actually the guy who wrote the book about sort of, what you could get for a penny was actually fairly critical, because he was saying, well, actually you spend all that time in there. The other thing to say is, okay, what you're saying is 1/8 of your daily work income would have gone on 1 cup of coffee, right?
Yeah.
So that's 7/8 left to do everything else. Now, to give you some context of that, the £18 that you worked out, that starts sounding pretty substantive to me. It's not something that I go in and think that I'm not paying nothing. Put it that way.
It's a middle class expenditure. You see, it's hard to justify this if you're on, kind of very.
I'm
very
sorry
low
to tell you
salaries.
that I would be very, and indeed have never in my life paid £18 for a cup of coffee of any kind.
But have you paid £18 for a book?
Have I paid £18
For a day's
book?
education?
Yes, I
have.
have.
You paid £18 for a day's education?
I have. Though, listeners,
Well,
I'm
that's what
pleased
you're
to tell
getting,
you, my book is not £18. However,
cheaper.
yes, no, that is a very fair point. Yes, I have often paid more than £18 for a book.
So, yeah.